Two pistols, one man, both triggers pulled, neither fired. The first time an American president was ever targeted for assassination, the would-be killer stood feet from Andrew Jackson at the steps of the United States Capitol. It was January 30th, 1835. Jackson had just left a congressional funeral. Richard Lawrence, an unemployed house painter gripped by delusion. He believed he was King Richard III and that Jackson owed him money, raised his first weapon and fired at the president's back. The gun misfired. He drew a second pistol. That one misfired too. Jackson, 67 years old, turned and charged him with his walking cane. Bystanders, including Congressman Davy Crockett, wrestled Lawrence to the ground. When the pistols were tested decades later by Smithsonian researchers, they fired normally. In the damp, misty air that morning, something had spared the president. Historians still debate whether the weather played a role. The odds of two successive misfires were vanishingly small. Jackson would call it divine providence. Lawrence was found not guilty by reason of insanity and spent the rest of his life in an institution. He had come within a trigger's pull of changing history. What followed over the next 2 centuries would prove that luck, chance, and a few inches would decide life and death for the men who held the office again and again. 77 years later, another president faced a bullet. Theodore Roosevelt was no longer in office. He was running again as a third-party candidate for the Bull Moose Party when John Schrank stepped out of the crowd outside the Gilpatrick Hotel in Milwaukee and shot him in the chest at close range with a .38 caliber revolver. Roosevelt had a 50-page campaign speech folded in his breast pocket and a steel eyeglasses case. The bullet tore through the manuscript and the metal case slowed and lodged in his chest. It fractured a rib but missed his heart and lungs. He was bleeding. He was told to go to the hospital. Instead, he went to the stage. He held up the speech, showed the hole to the crowd, and told them it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. He spoke for nearly an hour before he let anyone treat him. The crowd had no idea how close it had been. Doctors later decided it was safer to leave the bullet where it was than to risk surgery. Schrank had been driven by a dream in which he believed the ghost of William McKinley had ordered him to kill Roosevelt. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity and spent 29 years in a Wisconsin mental hospital. The bullet stayed in Roosevelt's chest for the rest of his life. The speech had done its job. But that wasn't the end of the pattern. What happened next would leave an innocent man dead and a president-elect untouched. On a February night in 1933, in Miami's Bayfront Park, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had just finished a short speech from the back of his car. It was past 9 in the evening. He was president-elect. Giuseppe Zangara pushed through the crowd with a .32 caliber revolver and fired 5 times. Roosevelt was unharmed. The bullets found other bodies. Chicago's mayor, Anton Cermak, standing beside the car, was hit. He would die 19 days later from sepsis. The bullet had perforated his colon and led to peritonitis. 4 others were wounded. Zangara had wanted to kill the rich and the powerful. He said so in court. He pleaded guilty to murder and attempted murder and was executed. Roosevelt was sworn in as president weeks after the attempt. The line between him and Cermak that night was nothing but chance. One man would lead the nation through depression and war. The other stood in the wrong place.
At the time, no one could have known how many more near misses lay ahead or how close the next one would come. The next attack would not be in a crowd. It would be at the president's front door. The White House was under renovation in the fall of 1950. Harry Truman and his family were living across the street at Blair House on Pennsylvania Avenue. The building was less fortified than the executive mansion. On November 1st, 2 Puerto Rican nationalists, Oscar Collazo and Gracilio Torresola, walked up to the front steps in broad daylight and opened fire. They had come to draw attention to Puerto Rico's status. They had not even confirmed Truman would be home. They never made it inside. A gunfight erupted on the steps. Secret Service agent Leslie Koffelt was mortally wounded. Before he died, he fired once and killed Torresola. Another agent, Floyd Boring, shot Collazo. White House policeman Donald Birdsell and Officer Joseph Downs were injured. Truman was inside unhurt. He kept his appointments that day and later said a president has to expect these things. Collazo was convicted of murder and assault and sentenced to death. Truman commuted his sentence to life in prison in 1952. Collazo would serve 29 years before his release. The attack had been meant to send a message. One guard had given his life to stop it.
Something worse was coming. Within a single presidency, one man would stand in the crosshairs twice in 17 days. No other president would face 2 separate attempts in so short a span. Gerald Ford had taken office after Nixon's resignation. On September 5, 1975, in Sacramento near the California state capitol, a young woman in a red robe stepped toward him in a crowd. Lynette Fromm, 26, a follower of Charles Manson, pointed an M1911 pistol at the president. She had not chambered a round. The gun did not fire. Secret Service agent Larry Bendorf grabbed the weapon and forced her to the ground. Ford went on with his schedule and did not mention the incident publicly. Frumey was convicted and sentenced to life. She would serve 34 years before her release. 17 days later in San Francisco outside the St. Francis Hotel after Ford had addressed the World Affairs Council, Sarah Jane Moore, a 45-year-old accountant, raised a .38 caliber revolver and fired once from about 40 feet away. The shot missed Ford's head by 5 inches. A bystander, Oliver Sipple, a former Marine, grabbed her arm before she could fire again. Moore said she was driven by revolutionary politics and by Ford's pardon of Nixon. She was sentenced to life and would serve 32 years, 2 attempts, 2 failures. One President Ford would later say he had never felt his life was in danger. The record suggests otherwise. Frumey's gun had simply not been ready. Moore's bullet had passed 5 inches from his head. If you are finding this deep dive into the men who came within inches of death compelling, like this video and subscribe for more stories from the edge of American history. The next attempt would not miss. And this time, the consequences would stretch across decades. On March 30th, 1981, Ronald Reagan walked out of the Washington Hilton. He was the only sitting president ever to be wounded in an assassination attempt. John Hinckley Jr. fired a revolver. The bullet hit the limousine, ricocheted, and struck Reagan under his left arm. It broke a rib, punctured a lung, and caused severe internal bleeding. He was rushed to surgery and would be released on April 11th. 3 others were hit. White House Press Secretary James Brady was shot in the head. He lived, but with permanent brain damage. Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy and D.C. police officer Thomas Delahanty were wounded. Hinckley had been obsessed with the actress Jodie Foster. He had seen the film Taxi Driver at least 15 times and believed killing the president would impress her. In 1982, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity. His verdict would lead Congress and many states to narrow the insanity defense. He remained in a Washington psychiatric hospital until his release in 2016. Reagan recovered and returned to the Oval Office. James Brady lived for 33 more years. His death in 2014 was ruled a homicide. The bullet had never stopped doing its work. His name would be attached to the law that tightened background checks for gun buyers. The pattern held. Luck. Distance. A malfunction. A stranger's hand. Each time, the story could have ended differently. In May 2005, in Tbilisi, Georgia, George W. Bush stood behind bulletproof glass with the country's president, Mikhail Saakashvili, at Freedom Square. A live Soviet-era hand grenade was thrown toward the stage. It landed in the crowd, roughly 100 feet from where the 2 leaders stood. The device did not detonate. The FBI later confirmed it was a live RGD-5 grenade. A tartan cloth had prevented the firing lever from moving. If it had gone off, fragments could have reached the stage. The man who threw it, Vladimir Arutunian, was arrested in July after a shootout that killed a Georgian officer. He said he wanted to kill Bush. He was indicted in the United States on assassination charges. The grenade was real. The fuse had failed. Another inch, another twist of fate, and the story would have been different. The pattern would repeat one more time. On July 13, 2024, at a campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, President Donald Trump was speaking when gunfire rang out. Thomas Matthew Crooks, 20, had taken position on a rooftop about 450 feet away and fired an AR-15-style rifle. A bullet struck Trump in the right ear. The FBI would later confirm it was a bullet from the shooter's rifle. One attendee, Corey Comparator, a firefighter and father of 2, was killed. 2 others were wounded. Secret Service killed Crooks at the scene. Trump was treated at a local hospital and released the same night. He had come within a fraction of an inch of a far worse fate. His physician later said the bullet had come less than a quarter of an inch from his head. Another president, another near miss. The list had grown by 1. Every one of these men held the same office. Each of them stood in the path of someone who wanted them dead. Some were saved by a misfire, a folded speech, a bystander, or a faulty fuse. The history of the presidency is also a history of near misses, of moments when the line between survival and tragedy was almost invisible. The motives varied. Delusion, politics obsession. Grievance, the outcomes did not. They lived. Others sometimes did not. Guards died. A mayor died. A press secretary carried the wound for 33 years. It is a legacy written not just in ink, but in the miraculous inches that separate survival from tragedy. Behind every leader stands a shadow, and between them and the end, only the narrowest margin of luck. History proves the presidency is a high-stakes tightrope. Behind every leader stands a shadow, and between them and the end, only the narrowest margin of luck.